I have a very exciting game to share with you guys today. So this past weekend, I played in the Alabama State Championship. This is the second year I've played in it. Last year, I played in the reserve section, which is the second highest section. But this year, due to some recent rating increases, I was able to play in the top section, which was a really great experience because I came into the tournament rated 1659, and this section was 1600 plus. So actually, all of my opponents for the entire event were at least 100 points higher rated than me, and I got to play 3 masters, which was just a really great experience for me to get to play some stronger players. And it led me to this game, which turned out to be my first ever over the board win over a master. So I'm very excited to share this game with you. And yeah, let's just go ahead and get into it. So I had the black pieces, and I guess a little background about my opponent. I don't know a ton about him, but I know that he's been a master for several decades. He's a well-known figure in Alabama chess, so it's great to have this one. But yeah, so he played d4, and I like to play the King's Indian. In some of the other rounds, I mixed up my openings because I was trying to sort of match openings to opponents that I thought would either give me an advantage or sort of get them out of their, theoretical prep. But I didn't really have anything special cooked up for this game, so I just played my normal opening, which would be the King's Indian. So we got a pretty normal looking King's Indian through 3.5 moves here, and I like to play this line where you castle right away rather than the most common move d6. And I've mentioned this many times on streams and probably in past YouTube videos, that I kind of do this because I'm inspired by a famous Bobby Fischer game where Fischer did the same thing. He castled immediately, and his opponent, I believe his name was Rene Letelier Martiner, but I probably mispronounced or got some of that wrong. But White in that game played e5, and Fischer went back, and he played f4, and Fischer won this brilliant game that culminated in a really pretty queen sacrifice. But basically, Fischer just, tried to counterattack the center and break up White's center, and all of his pieces got fantastic. So that game's sort of my inspiration for playing castles here on move, what is this, 4? Yeah, move 4, rather than d6. So in this game, my opponent took a different approach, but with similar sort of intentions, I thought. And he played f4 right away, which I've seen before online, but I didn't really remember any kind of opening idea, like, what am I supposed to do against this? And I have to admit, at some point during the game, I sort of had this thought of like, uh-oh, I'm sitting here playing a national master, and I have black. I'm playing the King's Indian, which is already a little, I mean, at this level, it's not really dubious, but, computer's not going to like it. And he's got this imposing wall of pawns that is just like physically staring me down. It felt like these pawns were just like, roadblock. Like, he's going to try to run me off the board, and my pieces aren't going to be able to move, and I'm not going to be able to do anything. So this was already an intimidating position to face. And yeah, I sort of came up with an idea to try and chip away at these pawns, which is, I think, what black wants to do when white, sort of establishes a big center like this. Hyper-modern idea, you chip away later. So I decided I wanted to play the move e5, and after the game, he suggested that playing c5 was a more normal approach. But I started with the move d6, which I think you pretty much will always play in the King's Indian because your pieces can get out, and you're either going to play c5 or e5 later. So very logical move. He develops his knight, so I mean, this setup is like even more imposing for white now. And I played, I assume, a pretty dubious move here. I know the computer is not a big fan, but I played knight f to d7. And the reason for that is that I wanted to play e5, and I thought that it was going to be too difficult to play e5 without this bishop's help. So I really need the bishop supporting the e5 advance in order for it to happen. And I thought if I played, a different way where I bring this knight to d7, and I could play for c5 there, but I just decided I wanted to play for e5. I don't really have a good reason for why I thought e5 was better than c5. I guess my reason is that normally in the King's Indian I play e5, so that felt a little more comfortable to me than to try to play c5. But anyway, so this is a bit of a strange move, moving the knight twice, sort of blocking these pieces, but I thought it was important to play e5. Okay, and then he did something. Let's see, where are we? Knight FD. Yeah, he just kept developing. That makes a lot of sense. And I played e5 like I wanted to, and he took with the f pawn. That makes sense. He's trading, a flank pawn for a center pawn, so that's great for him. I took back with the pawn, of course, and he played d5. And around this moment, it may have been a few moves later, I'm not sure, but I sort of realized that this pawn structure is very similar to a common pawn structure in the King's Indian, I think it's called the Petrossian Variation or the Advanced Variation, which would go like this if we back up here. So if white hadn't played f4 and he just sort of develops, oh, not that piece. If he just develops sort of normally, then this is a common way the game could go. And we sort of ended up with this same pawn structure, except for my d pawn had been traded for his f pawn. And I assumed that that was probably good for him, because like I said, he traded a flank pawn for a center pawn. My e5 pawn isn't supported as well. c5 isn't supported as well. Let's go back to the position that actually happened in the game. But yeah, so we can see a very similar pawn structure. These pawns are missing, so I don't have as much control of the center, and he's going to get an open line for his rook when he castles, inevitably. Which might make it harder for me to play f5, very typical break in the King's Indian. So I kind of thought, like, okay, he probably got a decent opening advantage here, because this kind of just looks like an improvement over the advanced King's Indian to me. Also, like, this knight is sort of blocked, and, black's going to have to untangle a little bit. But actually the computer is saying it's not that bad. Like, it's giving white a little more than half a pawn. So really can't complain too much about that. I guess one benefit is my knight's not on f6, so I might be able to play f5 quickly, which, like I said, is usually desirable. So I played a5, and this is sort of going back to the fact that I thought about this is similar to an advanced King's Indian. a5 is a common idea because you want to put the knight on c5, which is the square that's just been weakened by white's last move, d5, but you don't want a pawn to show up on b4 and take that square away from you. So a5 is sort of supporting an eventual knight on c5. And he castled. That makes a ton of sense, obviously. And normally this knight, you would go like knight a6 and c5, but I figured this knight was already, in a weird spot, so let's put that knight on c5. And, when I was considering this, I have to kind of think of a plan, like, what am I doing with this knight then? Since he normally would end up there, what's he gonna do now? And I think there's maybe a few possibilities for the queen knight. I mean, he could end up going to b4 in some circumstance. I think that's probably unlikely, but because I don't have a pawn on d6, I have to think about white playing d6. And I thought maybe it would be nice to just park my knight on d6, which takes a long time, but it can be achieved. So I thought that was the likely destination for the queen knight, which it's kind of funny because, it's just weird that the knights took such strange routes to get to the squares where I'm planning to put them on. That's a lot of knight moves to not really get that far up the board. So again, a little dubious probably. Okay, he developed his bishop, and he even gets to develop it with a threat, which normally you wouldn't get if there's a pawn on d6. But queen e7 is a very natural defense, and I'm supporting this a little bit more. I guess now my bishop has some flexibility if I want to somehow do something else with my bishop. and he brought his queen out. Now his rooks are connected. He sort of completed development, and he's also overprotecting a pawn. So now this knight is free to move if it needs to. And I developed this knight, and again, I'm still sort of thinking about this plan. It's a long way off, but what else is this knight really going to do? I mean, again, I could kind of shoot for b4, but I don't think I really accomplished that much by getting to b4. I mean, I attack his queen, but his queen moves, and I think that's kind of that. So I thought the knight really belonged on d6. Also, I didn't mention, but that also puts pressure on these points, which could be tender. So knight bd7, and he played b3. This is a common idea that white has when black has the knight on c5 supported by the pawn on a5. If white wants to get rid of this knight, which he probably should, then you really want to play b4, right? Like, that's how we would get rid of the knight. Unfortunately, if you start with a3, then black can just play a4. And due to the en passant rule, b4 is never going to happen, because b4, I'm always taking en passant. My knight's going to sit there forever. My rook's on an open line. So this is no good for white. That's not the right approach to try to get rid of the knight. The right approach is you have to play b3 first, then you play a3, then you play b4, and there's no en passant, because it's not legal. So it's a slow plan, but it eventually gets rid of what's probably black's best piece, so kind of worth it. Okay, I played h6, which I guess the computer apparently doesn't like. But my thought with h6 was, what I'd really like to do is play f5. That's a very common King's Indian break, and it's possibly even better here than normal because his last move, weakened this diagonal. And my bishop is sort of here waiting to pounce on that, hopefully. So if I can get f5 in, make this pawn move, he probably wouldn't move it, but if it did move, then, this bishop is suddenly getting very powerful after, like, e4. So I want to play f5, but I have to ask myself, what's the downside of f5? And the downside is that I'm weakening e6. So I was afraid of this knight coming and landing on e6. In retrospect, that may not have been that big of a deal, because I do have this knight on c5 that's, ready to take it out. And if he, I got another knight that can go to c5 if he wants to trade. So I don't know if h6 was really necessary. To be honest, I think I just probably didn't even see that my knight on c5 is defending e6. Okay, but that was the rationale behind h6. He maneuvered his knight, and I think the reason for this is he's anticipating f5. He knows that's my plan, and now he's got more pieces controlling it. So it's a little bit harder for me to play f5. So now if I want to play f5 and not lose a pawn, then I'm going to need another piece's help. And in that case, the piece is the bishop, which is often kind of just sitting on the starting square in the King's Indian. But it can still be a useful piece, often helping to play f5. And in some cases, if white plays h3, bishop takes h3 is even a tactic. Way later in the game, once black has pushed all these pawns and started getting knights into annoying squares. But sometimes bishop takes h3 is a tactical shot. Anyway, so I played knight f6. I need my bishop's help to play f5, and I'm still sort of thinking this knight is ultimately gonna reroute to d6. I think it was here that I realized I can't put my knight on d6 because this knight drops, but we'll solve that problem later. And I'm also sort of threatening knight g4, which, I mean, this bishop doesn't have anywhere to go that doesn't get exchanged for a knight. So he didn't want to allow that, and understandably so. This is white's good bishop. So he stopped it with h3, and that sort of got me a free tempo. Like, I can continue with my plan a little bit more quickly since he had to play kind of a waiting move. Okay, and he played a3, so he went back to his previous plan of evicting this knight from c5. And I think at this point in the game, I felt like probably my position wasn't so good. because I wasn't sure that this kingside attack was going to be as effective as it normally would be in the King's Indian. Since white has the open F file, the rook can sort of help things a bit. You know, a lot of times in the King's Indian, white just gets kind of constricted over here, and the pieces can't move on the king side. But it feels like that maybe that's a little less likely to happen in this particular position. So I wasn't feeling great about the position, but I kind of felt like, I mean, my only real plan is f5. So I'm just gonna stick with what I know basically. And I thought there was some reasonable play. Like if he takes, I could take with the bishop. I'm tempoing the queen. I'm coordinating with this knight potentially to get into an annoying square. And, you know, I still have this e4 idea to try to cause him problems on the diagonal. Usually white is not taking in the... Well, okay, I guess that's not correct. A lot of times white isn't taking. I think sometimes white does. But he didn't take. He played bishop f3, which surprised me a little bit. Just because after I play f4, it seems like this pawn is sort of blocking all of his pieces. So it feels a little non-harmonious to me. But I guess he didn't want the position to open up for my bishops, I assume, is the thought. Makes sense. Okay, so he saved his bishop, of course. And I did something here, but I don't remember what. I think I remember. Yeah, I just kept going with my kingside attack. Like that's that's sort of my only plan. G5, and I want to play knight f6. I want to play h5 and g4, and just start breaking in there. That's pretty much the thought. Sort of a caveman plan, but what else can you do? And he played another move here that surprised me. I was expecting he's going to play b4, because that was the idea, right? To kick my knight out. But he made a move that seems like it's trying to prepare b4, but I don't really understand it. He played rook fb1. So I thought, like, well, if he plays b4, this is likely the game continuation. And I'd probably take the rook, and he would take back. So after he plays rook fb8, fb1, excuse me, now if we do the same thing, like he sort of wasted a tempo because the rook made a pit stop here on b1 before it got to a1. So I don't really understand rook fb1. Okay, so after rook fb1, I brought my knight to f6. Again, I want to play h5 g4 and just break through and try to attack and hope that because all of his pieces are on the queen side, that, you know, he's not gonna, that I'll be able to cause trouble on the king side. Yep, and he played b4, which I thought was his plan, and basically that variation that I suggested happened, where we traded and we traded rooks, and it seems like rook fb1 just sort of lost its tempo. So I don't understand why rook fb1. I don't understand the idea. And my knight is still attacked, so I can't quite yet continue doing all this stuff that I want to do. I got to save my knight. I didn't really want to block the bishop because I need the bishop's help probably to play g4. And so I played knight a6. And I thought, you know, the knight, you know, maybe it's kind of just helping hold things down on the queen side. And I do have an immediate threat here on b4. If he plays b5, I think I can just go back and play b6 and hopefully make it hard for white to get the queenside play that he's normally getting in the King's Indian. But I did overlook something here. And he played a move that I hadn't considered at all. And it's a move that I should consider because it's a capture. So I don't think I mentioned this yet, but the time control was 2 hours per side with a 5-second delay. And at this point in the game, I wrote down the clock times. I had 70 minutes left, and he had 90. So I was down 20 minutes on the clock, but I still had well over an hour. So I should be analyzing pretty much any capture, any semi-reasonable looking capture, let's say, to see if it leads anywhere. But I didn't here, and he surprised me with rook takes a6. Now, luckily for me, rook takes a6 is actually not such a great move. It does work tactically. So the idea is that white would like to play bishop c5, which is, again, an idea I should see. But obviously the knight is defending, so let's take out the knight, and then let's play bishop c5. And now I sort of have to decide where to put my queen. I don't really remember. I mean, I put my queen on f7, and I think, you know, I'm just kind of hope, like, hey, this battery could be good, but I do expect he'll take my rook. He's not, I mean, maybe he won't, but if he doesn't, then I have this nice battery on the f-file. So he did take my rook, which makes sense. That arrow was already drawn for some reason. I decided to take with the bishop because the bishop's not really very good on g7. This pawn doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon, and I don't think the bishop's going to go to this diagonal anytime soon either. So bishop f8 seems like a good move. I'm immediately threatening the b4 pawn, and this also, you know, kind of shelters my king. Now that there's no rooks around, you know, I could have to watch out for some queen check on the back rank or something like that. And I'm also watching this square, which is, you know, always has been sort of tenuous the whole game. So if we go back, I think that this idea of rook takes a6 is one of those ideas that when you see it, you're like, oh, cool, I can do that. And it's like tactically justified. But that doesn't always mean that it's a good idea. And, you know, he's a much stronger player than me. Obviously, he thought it was a good idea. And I think the rationale, like the argument for rook takes a6 is that you shatter black's queenside pawns. So black has weak pawns here. In the King's Indian, white's normally trying to win on the queen side. So now hopefully he'll be able to win some pawns and just promote and crush me. Now, on the other hand, the net effect, if we think about what pieces were traded here, these rooks got traded. I think it's pretty clear that the A rook is, well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe the A rook is not better than the F rook, because he does have to be careful about this later. But the rooks got traded. We'll call that a wash. But this knight got traded for this bishop. And I think there's absolutely no question that the F2 bishop is a more important, a more valuable piece than the A6 knight. Because obviously black has some weak dark squares, you know, over here. And this knight is sort of just a defensive piece. It's sort of just trying to keep the queen side under control. But it doesn't really have, it's not an active piece. It doesn't even really have prospects for activity. Like, how would we even try to get this knight active, you know? So his judgment was that giving up the better minor piece was worth ruining the structure. And luckily for me, the computer doesn't agree. So the computer is saying that the position's now equal. And I mean, also it should be noted that white gave up the bishop pair. So now black does have the bishop pair, even though both the bishops are on their starting square, which I thought was kind of funny. Okay, so we'll move on from that sequence. So after bishop f8, he played queen a4, and yeah, he's getting his queen active, and he wants to put pressure on this weak pawn. Pretty sensible. I mean, I was still fairly afraid at this point, because it does look like, you know, if he can win a pawn, which the a6 pawn is going to be tough to defend, right? Because this bishop can come, and, you know, it's hard to get another piece over to defend the a6 pawn. If I do, I'm really tying myself down. And if it falls, then, you know, this 3 versus 1 looks very scary. So I wasn't sure whether I needed to try to, like, defend or to stay aggressive and keep attacking. But usually in the King's Indian, if you can keep attacking, you know, with black, then you want to do so. You want to create problems for their king. So I played h5, and I'm just going to keep going over here, and we'll see what happens. So he rerouted the bishop, which makes a lot of sense, because the bishop is about to be tempoed by g4, and he wants to win this pawn on a6. And also, I think part of his idea was now after g4, since the bishop is not attacked, white can play h4, which he did, and try to keep the king side closed, which is what white wants to do. So again, I was still very scared here. I sort of misevaluated the position. I thought white still had an advantage, possibly a big advantage. And you may notice that the computer is actually now giving a pretty big advantage to black. There is actually a very strong move here for black, which I sadly missed. So maybe take some time and try to see what you would do with black if you had this position. And as I was saying, usually if black can keep attacking, then black should do so. So the computer move for black is to go ahead and play f3. I'm going to make sure I'm right about that. Yeah, so the computer wants to go ahead and break through with f3, which I think I saw was legal, but I probably didn't really analyze it enough because it looks like white has too many defenders. But again, white's king is getting very, very open here. So it's a pawn sacrifice, but you get something pretty tangible. And I believe the computer line is f3 takes and then queen g6. Yeah, and we're just trying to, you know, get in there. And admittedly, like, I would be pretty scared if I was white and had this position. It looks scary. And probably, like, just from a standpoint of you know, he's a stronger player than me, like a much stronger player. Like, these kind of double-edged positions where anyone could get mated, that's probably better for me, because if it's a 50-50 chance that I win the game, that's good. That's better than my normal odds, you know, playing against him. So I missed that idea, or I misevaluated it. And I thought I needed to come up with something to sort of stop c5. Or maybe not, maybe stop is the wrong word, but I'm anticipating c5 is going to happen. He's going to, you know, try to just keep breaking through, winning this pawn and crush me. So I came up with a different idea. And, you know, maybe some of you guys came up with a similar idea, but I played queen e7, which the computer's saying is a blunder. It's a blunder because it's not f3. F3 is in the computer's eyes, a move that gives black probably a winning position. The idea with queen e7 is twofold. One, we are hitting the b4 pawn immediately, and we're x-raying this weak pawn on h4. If the queen can get in over there, you know, we might even, in some cases, get out with like a perpetual, which would be a fantastic result for me to draw Charles. So I was sort of thinking about that, but I also liked, well, maybe I shouldn't say, because there's a nice move coming up that I don't want to ruin, but it's sort of related to queen e7. We'll say that. So he did play c5, which is what I expected, because now he's protected b4. He's ready to capture on a6, and there's really no way for me to defend a6. So from white's point of view, if you're not being alert, it kind of looks like white's breaking through and black's pieces are still sort of tangled, which I guess played to my advantage, because black actually does have some aggressive ideas that luckily for me he missed. So I played knight d7, and he took the pawn on a6, and this was actually the game-losing blunder for him. So this is a great moment, again, to pause and see if you can figure out what black should do here. There are a lot of tempting options. Well, I mean, I guess there's two tempting ideas, and I spent a long time on this move trying to figure out which one was stronger and like which move order I should go with, how to make everything come together in the best way. So one option would be to take here, which sort of looks impossible because our bishop is hanging, but we have this check, and even if he blocks with the knight, this knight's also hanging. Although I guess our knight's hanging. So, I mean, queen h5 is definitely worth thinking about. I mean, you also have to analyze, you know, taking first and then playing queen h5. The problem with that is that white's queen is getting really active. That looks scary. It's hard to believe that we could have any advantage there, or we might be getting checkmated. So queen h5 doesn't seem to work right away. But the other idea is the actual winning plan, and that is to take on c5 right away with the knight. So this works tactically because if he takes back, then I take with the queen, and I'm forking the king and the knight, so I'm going to get my material back. Also, my queen's getting tremendously active. This knight is hanging, so even though my bishop's hanging, he still has pieces hanging. And basically this position's getting really double-edged. It's getting to be kind of a race. Which side is going to checkmate the opponent's king first? But black has the initiative. Black is going first in this race, so that's very advantageous for black. Now here, he needed to find a very specific defensive idea in order to save the game. Well, I mean, I guess there were other potential pitfalls later for black. He captured the knight right away, which makes a lot of sense because it looks like, well, my queen's attacked and my bishop is hanging. So it's hard to kind of imagine that there's another move other than taking the knight. It looks like white's going to lose material. But actually, the computer points out the move d6. And you'll see this is only giving black, -2. d6 is sort of hard for me to understand. But my limited understanding of d6 is that now this bishop is going to be able to return, give a check, and that's sort of getting a little bit of initiative for white. So black isn't going to have an immediate time to just start attacking the white king. Black still has to think about the queen coming in, and I guess the knight can even come in. So I mean, I can play out some of the computer moves, but I can't claim to really be good enough to understand the idea fully, because it still seems like white's going to be in trouble, with our queen coming in. So yeah, it's giving this line, and I mean, this is getting kind of crazy, right? This is hard to evaluate, but yeah. So the computer still likes black, but I mean, this is crazy. So I'm not going to jump down this rabbit hole too much further. So he took the knight, which is a very logical looking move, but now he's completely lost. So I take the pawn with check, and he made another, I guess probably a slight mistake here. He played king f1. The computer does prefer king h1, unless it prefers king h2. I can't remember. King h1. And I still had to think, a decent amount here, because I could just grab the knight, or I could take the bishop first and then grab the knight. So my thought process here was, I couldn't find anything super concrete. Like I couldn't find one move leads to mate and the other one doesn't, or one line I get mated and the other line I don't. But basically I just decided if I take the bishop and the queen takes, like he's one tempo closer to starting to, attack my king, to start giving me checks. So it seems less likely that I'm going to get a win if he can get his queen in here and start checking me. So I take the knight, and that makes it more difficult for his queen to start harassing me. He did take the bishop, and I took the knight. And I think it was here that he fought a long time. I think once this position arose on the board, he kind of realized how bad it is for white. And I mean, in fact, it's actually just lost for white. So, I mean, I wrote down the move times as I said. So he thought for 12 minutes on this move, which is a pretty decent think in game 120, and he played bishop e6 check, which I don't think really changes the position that much. I pretty quickly played king h8, and then he thought for another 17 minutes here. And the truth is, it's just lost. White's just lost, and black has many attacking ideas, and white just can't stop them all. So probably the most important thing to point out is that the white queen is responsible for defending the d1 square. If the white queen tries to get away and starts trying to come in here somehow, so let's just put this on the board, to threaten h5, then white just gets checkmated immediately. This is checkmate. So from white's point of view, queen d1 absolutely cannot ever be allowed. So you got to stop that. This bishop's getting ready to come in somewhere. But if the bishop comes in, then there's, some potential checks, and the tables could turn pretty quickly. And black's also got some pawns that are ready to help out at a moment's notice. So he played what turned out to be not the best defensive move. He played d6. And I think the idea of d6, I think one idea was to keep the bishop out. So now, and there's not going to be a line where like I check his king goes to a dark square, and then my bishop comes in with check. So I think that was a big part of the idea. And it also might be that he knew that he was lost, and he's kind of playing hope chess, like, okay, if black takes with the bishop, then black's probably losing after this check happens. And then I think the other idea was to try to play queen a2, and I have a specific reason for thinking that. But this is actually it's actually forced mate for black now. So this is another good puzzle position. Pause the video and try to find the forced mate for black. So luckily for me, since he thought 17 minutes before making this move, I had a lot of time to sort of analyze what my threats were and how I could respond to different moves. I didn't see d6 was a move I didn't consider, but since I sort of understood the threats that existed, d6 didn't address one of my threats, and that threat is g3. So now it's forced mate. Mate is threatened on f2, and you can't really stop it. I mean, you can give away your queen if you want to, but not only are we threatening mate on f2, we're also threatening mate on d1. So the queen's defending d1, and it can't really defend both, right? So the only move that defends both is queen c2. I mean, then you're giving away your queen, and you're just delaying the inevitable. So there's no move here. He was nice and actually let me play the checkmate. So he moved his queen back to a2, which I think was another point of d6. And also maybe he's just, from a game theory point of view, like, why not play queen a2 and hope that your opponent doesn't see queen d1? But I saw queen d1. So that was how the game ended. Now if we go back, white has a better defensive move here, and the better defensive move is to play queen a1, which keeps defense of d1, but you're also guarding the back rank against other checks, and you're putting pressure on this pawn. So after queen a1, there's actually only two moves for black here. There's only two moves that are winning. So there's two important ideas, and you kind of have to play them in one order or the other. The most logical move to me is to play queen d3 check, and black's king will probably try to run to the corner, and now our bishop can come in with check. The king runs again, and this is a very, very interesting position to me because black has a lot of initiative, but black has to be very careful. And in fact, there's only one move for black that wins the game, and if you don't play the winning move with black here, you lose. White wins. So this is a very critical position. I'm probably kind of lucky that my opponent didn't give me this test, let's say. But try to pause the video and see if you can find the best move for black here. So in these kind of positions, we always like to analyze the most forcing moves first. But unfortunately, we don't really have any good checks. We could capture this pawn, but then we're letting white get the initiative because white can give a check here, and his queen and his bishop are actually coordinating pretty well. So we would get in a lot of trouble. So the key to this position is actually to avoid checks. And the only winning move for black is king h7, which I think is just beautiful. Like king h7, and now you can't attack me, and I'll be fine. Isn't that kind of crazy? So white's problem is that the queen is still tied to the back rank, because if the queen leaves the back rank, then we're gonna have a mate in 2. Some route of getting to g1 with mate. So moves like taking the pawn or trying to get in here are just not fast enough. I'm gonna see if I can even remember the analysis I did earlier. So the only move that keeps fighting for white is to play bishop f5 check. After bishop f5 check, we want to avoid checks. We don't want to step, oops, on this diagonal, because then the white queen is going to take on e5 with check. And we don't want to go to the back row because, again, we're getting checked. And then our bishop, would have to go passive to try to block that. So by process of elimination, we just play king h6. And now white really has no checks. The only check is queen a6, but our queen guards that, luckily. So, going back, queen a1 was the best try for white. But black is still winning if black plays well. I like to think that, I would have found this idea given that I had still 30 minutes on my clock to think about it. And, if you realize that the important thing here is to not let your king get checked, not let white get an initiative, then, really this position is all about avoiding checks. And I think I would be able to find the idea of first walking the white king into the corner, and then king h7 to avoid checks, and our king is just safe on h6, and we win the game. Okay, so yeah, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm really excited to have won this game. Hopefully the first of many wins over titled players over the board, but hey, you got to start somewhere. So anyway, take care everyone. See you next time. Bye.